Hello, in this video I thought I'd try something different and talk about the exploration of the solar system in science fiction, and to some extent in actual science and history. Because it's potentially such a wide topic, I'm going to try and limit it. Perhaps I may stray occasionally, but I'm going to try and limit it by excluding those books that include aliens, or indeed colonies of humans that miraculously have appeared on these worlds with no history of coming from Earth. I'm going to try and limit it to books that I've read, or occasionally films that I've watched. And I'm going to try and make certain it has some personal link to me. And I'm going to start by talking about the actual science. And probably the history of exploration starts with the development of rockets. So a lot of that started in the Second World War. Now, I hope everyone immediately said, but you're too young. Maybe I'm wrong. But there is a link. In 1944, I think, possibly 45, a V2 bomb landed in the road in which I currently live. It was a massive explosion, and basically a lot of the houses along the road were structurally damaged and had to be demolished. No one actually died, and I found it very difficult to find any information about this other than what I was told as a child. But basically, I'm now in a terraced house, which is one of 17 that were rebuilt in 1947 and 48 after the old properties were demolished. And there were some properties in neighbouring roads which were also, I believe, demolished, but I haven't got any information about those. So in a way, I've been affected by the development of rocketry. I was born in my house. I lived a few years in North London, but basically I'm now back in what was my parents' house. They bought it off plan in 1947 when it was being built. As a young lad, probably from the late 50s through all the 60s, I was following the space race. It affected my interest in science, in space, in astronomy, and I took an interest. And obviously we all know the stories of those eras, the first orbit, the first circumvent the moon, and of course things have progressed, and now we've explored most of the planets and other large objects within the solar system. Trends have meant that these days some of the near space, especially exploration, is carried out by private enterprise rather than governments, or by NASA or the Russians. I'm generally in favour of us continuing to explore, and who knows what will happen. In terms of what I've watched in terms of real science, I'll talk about one or two events and films. There's the film of Apollo 13. I'm afraid I've never read a book about that, but I have watched the film and I did enjoy that. Perhaps in terms of history of NASA and people who've become involved in NASA, I read a book, and I'll show you, which I did quite enjoy, about some schoolboys who wanted to build their own rockets. And I think they eventually ended, or some of them ended up working for NASA, and that was very good. There was the film Hidden Figures about people who worked, black women, should I say, who worked for NASA. And I took an interest because I did a maths degree, so I found it quite interesting that a fair bit of it was concentrating on the mathematics. So that's basically the real science and what actually happened. I'm sure you could mention many other books, stories, films, but I'm going to move on to science fiction. Now, if you talk about the solar system, you've got to say that Earth is part of the solar system. And there have been many books about how the Earth will change in the future. Many of the science fiction novels that I've read about post-apocalyptic Earth, where something has destroyed the world as we know it, whether it's a virus, whether it's war, whether it's other things, whether it's the greenhouse effect. So, for example, there's been a great book by Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry for the Future, I believe it was called. I think it covers a lot of real science. It's interesting. I think it's, in my way, I think it's over-optimistic. I struggle to see how we're going to turn the tide against the greenhouse effect. I don't think politicians will ever manage. They're too concerned with the present and the near future, not the long term. There have been other books. I mean, I still remember one book, and I will show you, about the future and how Earth might develop. Now, I only ever read the first book in this series, Chung Kuo series, and this is book 1, The Middle Kingdom, and I've got a full set inscribed by David, the author. That postulates a future where China is the dominant world power. So when that was written 20 or 30 years ago, was there an element of foresight? And will they continue to dominate? And it talks about the growth of mega cities and so on. I found the book fairly hard work at the time, but I thought it was worth reading the rest of the series. But as I've so often done, I read book 1, spent time collecting the full series, and never managed to restart and read. So I think that's all I'm going to say about the Earth as part of the solar system. I'm going to go on now in terms of exploration of space. And I'm going to start with current books and work backwards, or current films. One series I'm going to mention is The Expanse by James S.A. Corey. Now, you could say this is excluded because of the proto-molecule. Is that alien or aliens? But I think the basis on which the novels start is a solar system that's been explored. People have moved out into the solar system. They've done their best to live on various bodies within the solar system. And the science was generally good. So I have to recommend that. Perhaps a more famous one and better known would be The Martian by Andy Weir. I've read the book, I've watched the film and enjoyed it. Another one that people might mention, perhaps closer to Earth, is Gravity. My own view is, while there were elements of true science in that, I really didn't enjoy the film. I thought it was Hollywood had over-egged too many things to make it realistic. I didn't enjoy it. going on what other books and going back a little bit in time, there have been some great books about our spread into the solar system. And I'm going to mention ones that I'm aware of. Kim Stanley Robinson again, the Mars Trilogy. A little bit like hard work, but generally worth the read and of interest. Ben Bova, going back a little bit further. His Grand Tour books, and I don't know how many of them are, but seem to be loads. And it's a long time since I read any. I've only read 3 or 4 of them. And I don't think I've read any this century. So I'll mention that, but I have read several. Stephen Baxter did the NASA trilogy. Again, I read one quite some time ago, and I never got round to finishing that. And if you go back a bit further into the 60s and 70s, you've got authors like Heinlein, Asimov, Clarke. Now, most of those authors I tended to read in the 70s and 80s and not much recently. And to be honest, my memory's going, so I'm not going to talk about any individual books, but I'm sure lots of you have your own favourites from that era. And I was never really a collector of the earlier books from perhaps the 50s and the 40s. One I do remember reading was by Frederick Brown, a great author, especially in terms of short fiction. But he did do one about exploration of the solar system. For the life of me, I can't remember which one it was. And to be honest, when I read that in the 70s, I even remember thinking then that it had dated badly. So going back before that, what was there before that? Now, I haven't read that much of earlier stuff, and I struggle, but I'm going to go back to Jules Verne. Again, I remember reading one of the Moon books, and I can't remember which one, back when I was a teenager. And from what I've read or recall, his was one of the first books to suggest effective firing a rocket like a missile. Totally unrealistic in terms of true science, but it did start to talk about going round the moon. It's one of the earlier books about that. Now, there were many books going back into antiquity that have various ways of reaching the moon and the other planets. There are some books which talk about flying, some about walking, some about transferring identities, but then that runs foul of my rule about not talking about aliens or humans on other planets. So I'm going to exclude most of those, and I'm going back a bit further. There was also a book, and I'm going to struggle to find this if I can find my notes. There was a book in 1865, which I haven't read, so I'm not going to say much about it, where the idea of using a rocket to get into space was supposedly first proposed. And it was called Voyage à Venus, so a French author, I presume. The final one I'm going to talk about is one which had a nice element of science in it, although the idea of how the people got off the Earth is what I will call pseudoscience. And that was the idea of blocking gravity. And And the book I'm going to talk about was written in 1847. It's a very thin book, and I have mentioned it before. And it's Orrin Lindsay's plan of aerial navigation and his wonderful voyage around the moon. Round the moon. And basically he gave a talk, whether it was intended as a spoof or not, in 1847. And subsequently he produced a leaflet. This is a modern reproduction, not an original. About his, or supposedly it was a student of his who travelled round the moon. And the book was based on the idea of blocking the effects of gravity, a material that could block or wouldn't be acted upon by gravity. It wasn't the first book that talked about blocking gravity or an anti-gravity and researching. Apparently there was a book in 1827 called Voyage to the Moon, which talked about anti-gravity. Now, whether it was the same or different, I do not know, as I haven't read that earlier book. But the reason I wanted to talk about this, and I said there was some real science in it, and it quite surprised me what was mentioned and covered in the book. And so I'm going to go through what was mentioned. Now, it is possible to find this book on the internet, so if anyone wants to read it without it being spoilt, now is your time to stop this video. But I'm going to talk about some of the scientific things that were included, and it's only a short book, a few pages. First thing he talked about was using a dog in a test. Now, obviously, you know some of the early space orbits used animals to see what the effect would be. And he proposed this in 1847. Was he the first to do that? I do not know. Admittedly, he didn't use the dog to go into orbit, rather to test his, as he called it, a balloon, in terms of going up into the very high atmosphere. He mentions weightlessness within his balloon. Had people worked that out scientifically at the time? How well known was it? I do not know. He recognised that as you go into space, it gets darker and darker, and when you're in space, it's almost totally black. Again, I suspect that was known science, but he mentioned it. He talked about insulating his balloon, because obviously as you go up through the atmosphere, it gets a lot colder. And with a slow ascent, he obviously didn't want cold, so he insulated the travelling device. He recognised the problems with air supply. He realised, and he mentioned the facts about how much oxygen people need every hour, whatever, and he worked out that his balloon would not be, or would not carry enough air. So he talked about compressing the oxygen. He went into details about how that would be done. Another problem he recognised was the issue of carbon dioxide, or as he calls it, carbonic acid. And so he took slaked lime in order to control the amount of carbonic acid there will be. And I hope I'm remembering correctly, I think slaked lime was used in Stargate universe, when they had problems with the air supply, they used slake lime to deal with the problems with carbon dioxide. He talked about the issues with provisions. Now, I'm not going to go... Oh, sorry, one last thing in terms of preparation. He realised the problems of the fact that humans breathe out moisture, and that moisture could have a bad effect. So for that, he took a chest of unslaked lime, which would extract, so he could open this chest occasionally, so it would reduce the amount of moisture in the air. So he gave a lot of thought to some of the practical issues of taking a balloon into space. And obviously, as a balloon, it's not a flimsy thing that had been around for hundreds of years. He means a shape like a balloon. I'm not going to talk about too much. He did calculations and gave various facts about travelling to the moon, circumnavigating the moon. They didn't land, but he used the speed they had from orbiting to help set the trajectory back to Earth. And coming back to Earth, he realised the issue of a large object hitting the atmosphere. Now, he was a bit limited. He only talked about light, not heat. But he did mention skipping, the effect that the balloon would bounce off the atmosphere. And so he talked about several bounces that happened while the balloon was slowing. So there was quite a large scientific element to that book. For me, that probably made this one of the most impressive early science fiction books. So if you haven't had a chance and have an interest in sort of early space flight, I think you will find that very interesting. Did D.W. Riddell, who wrote this, influence any later authors? Were they aware of his work? Some of the concepts he used could have been taken up by other authors. And he's done it in terms of telling the story that someone's wrote to him, explaining the story. And again, that is a concept or a trope that has been used by later authors. So I hope you've enjoyed this little waffle by me. I hope you found it interesting. It's a massive topic, and I've limited it to what I've read, what I know. So I hope you enjoyed. Please comment.